Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I'm John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. Good topic, let's do it. What family history or backstory were you finally informed about when you were old enough? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. When I was young, I thought it was really nice that my Nana lived with my aunt and her family since she was getting on a bit. And it meant she was looked after and there were always people around. Aunt had 6 kids. Occasionally, Aunt would gripe about being the one looking after Nana, since Aunt is also one of many kids, and being young I sympathized. But given they all spent loads of time with Nana too, I didn't think it was a big deal. You don't think about financial responsibility when you're young. I think just social and caring. Well, it turns out the reason Nana lives with Aunt is because Aunt and her husband convinced Nana to put the house in their name so they could look after her affairs, and sold it out from under her and invested the money in a pyramid scheme, so it's gone now. Because of this, her siblings refused to give Aunt a penny toward looking after Nana, since it's her fault Nana has no money or assets, and instead pay to take Nana out all the time, meals, shopping, and activities, so she doesn't go without. But they let Aunt struggle under the weight of Nana's general living expenses. Aunt's kids are all independent now, so they are not going to be impacted by money problems. Now I look back after her griping with annoyance and think what a terrible person she is. I have a niece I didn't know about until I was middle-aged. My oldest sister left home early while I was an oblivious child. It turned out she had gotten pregnant as a young teen and went to live with our grandmother to gestate, give birth, and give the baby up for adoption. For decades I never knew, until my sister called during my divorce years later and commented that she knew what it was like to have your life upended because of her daughter. What? She'd never had any other kids, so I realized I was really missing something. It turned out she thought Mom had eventually told me once I was an adult, and Mom thought she had eventually told me, so they both assumed I knew when I had no idea. A few years later, her daughter finally reached out for the info on file from the agency, so now she's part of the extended family, and my sister is bonus mom. They're both lucky the reunion went well. One of my cousins had a baby when she was 17. My aunt and uncle sent her out of state to a hospital where she gave him up for adoption. Years later, after he would have turned 18, my uncle started looking and finally found him years later. He was doing well and had a family of his own. My uncle didn't contact him and only told my aunt and my mom that the boy was fine. They decided that my cousin did not need to know where he was, and she died not knowing what had become of him. I have no idea if any of her siblings ever knew she had been given up as a child in her youth. If they did, they never said anything. The only reason I know is when I was going over my mom's will, I noticed she had this cousin listed to be my guardian if anything happened to her before I turned 18. I asked her why that cousin, and that's when the story came out. When I was a kid, I went to this science day camp for a few weeks. We did different things with a few teachers and volunteers, but there was one teacher's assistant who really stuck out to me. We hit it off immediately and had a blast together every day. During pickup time, the teacher joked to my dad about her TA and I acted like siblings. I remember my dad being really spacey for the rest of the day, even the week after that. Turns out, the TA and I are actually half siblings, with the same father. Our dad, sat me down a few years later and explained that he was 18 or 19. He accidentally, got his girlfriend pregnant. Both of them were devout Catholics, so she carried the child to term and abandoned her daughter afterwards. With no other options, he gave his daughter up for adoption. I haven't seen my sister since. Part of me wants to reach out because I have that information, but I'm also a bit nervous since we're both adults with our own sovereign lives now, not to mention the 16-year age gap. My father's side of the family had the help all the way up until the 70s or so. Their family employed a black woman who resided in a separate part of the home, did almost all the cooking, cleaning, babysat my father and his siblings, etc. But she was not permitted to eat at the same time as my father's family, to say the least. There was an extremely small room off the kitchen she was allowed to eat in by herself after the family had finished their meal. With that said, after my grandparents passed away, my father allocated a portion of his inheritance to her, so she would no longer have to work. It wasn't living lavishly or anything, but it was enough to get by. He also insisted absolutely that she be included in family events like holidays and birthdays, because she was also family. I grew up viewing her like a great aunt. Dad died blowing coke, not a virus that attacked his heart. The best part was that my dad's oldest brother was just candidly talking to me about the whole day, how he misses my dad and this and that. We were talking about getting clean for the kids and wives, and this quarter bag was the last go-round, but it did us in. Oh, my pops? Yeah. Oh, you don't know? Your mom didn't tell? She was very much into that lifestyle with your dad as well. No, she never told me my dad died snorting cocaine with his older brother, let alone the very last time before his demise. Also, that she does that with them as well. She spared me of the details. My mother was absolutely horrified to know they told me at 15 years old, 6 years after his death. Also, that she used with my dad. I didn't know any of this, and it damaged my relationship with my mom. It took a long time to work trust back from all that, purely because of the way it floated to me. It really hurt my mom. My uncle absolutely sent her to orbit over this, with a fallout that hasn't been repaired to this day 18 years later. Some families just never break the cycle and cause misery for others. My great-grandpa was gay. His best friend was his lover. One day, my great-grandpa was supposed to be watching my mom because my grandma and great-grandma were out doing something. They came home earlier than expected and found my grandpa and his bestie getting it on. My mom was in a separate room or something. She had no idea what was going on. All hell broke loose in my family, and my great-grandpa had to stop seeing his friend, though it's suspected they still saw each other in secret. That unfortunately explained why my grandma is so homophobic. My mom told me this story after I came out to her. She was super supportive and not surprised at all, but she begged me not to tell my grandma. As I got older, I heard about a cousin nearly marrying another unknown cousin at the time. They were engaged. Apparently his dad had stepped out quite frequently in the 60s, and the result was questioning any relationship he got into from our shared race and community. More personal to me was that my father, peach that he was, managed to sleep with my mother's twin within a year of them being married. Apparently this came out in their 50s, so surprise everyone. A sad one I learned on a road trip in my tweens. My mom and I were traveling, just chatting, and I started asking her about my cousin whom I named after. I have old parents. My mom was 40 when she had me. This cousin, whose funeral I attended at the ripe old age of 5, was in his mid-20s. Amazing musician, I'm told. Had a lot of mental health worries his whole life, and didn't really seek treatment until the late 70s. Big stigma, hush hush, you'll be fine. Called his parents absolutely shattered one night, and said the following words: "I'm so tired, I have Dad's revolver. Please talk me out of this." They didn't call him back until it was far too late. I didn't realize that my mom wasn't ever married to my father when she had my sister and me. I knew he had another family, a wife and kids. I guess my kid mind just never thought too deeply about it and figured at some point years ago he and my mom were officially together. But they never were. She told me over the phone in my junior year of college. It's so weird the way the universe works sometimes. To know that if my mom hadn't made an immoral choice, having a years-old relationship with a married man, and if he hadn't made an immoral to cheat on his wife, neither me nor my sister would exist. That their two wrongs brought us to life. It's an interesting space to exist in, had this impropriety not happened, or, immoral choice, you wouldn't exist. So, I'm assuming you like existing. So, it worked out. And hopefully all parties saw some goodness in time. My quiet, kind, straight-laced grandfather apparently had a brother I didn't know about. He was mixed in with the wrong crowd and got addicted to heroin. Naturally, my grandfather put him in rehab, or whatever the equivalent was in the early 1900s China. And he got clean, but fell back into it because he still hung out with the same crowd. So Grandpa was like, look, it's not hard to get clean. Tell you what, I'll get hooked on heroin with you, and then we'll get clean together, which is insane. Anyway, they go to rehab together, and then once they're out, Grandpa makes his brother join the Navy. But then he apparently died at sea. Sort of a backwards hidden story, my great uncle told me about his uncle who was shot to death by an angry husband while he was having breakfast with that guy's wife. He remembered having the newspaper hidden from him when he was young. I later found that newspaper article and found out that my ancestor had been eating dinner with a woman and a couple of other people when this guy ran in, shot my ancestor, and then ran out and shot himself. It was above board, and the guy was just jealous and crazy. So the actual story, while tragic, was not as scandalous as it was made out to be. My mother used to keep many secrets. She spoke often of her brother who served in the Army Air Force in World War II. He got back and went back to work on the railroad. He got terribly ill in a few years, which mystified all the doctors and everyone, she said. When my mom died, and I was with her younger sister, she said matter-of-factly that their brother had drunk himself to death. My mom also had been married before my dad, which she never spoke of until my brother was visiting with another relative who told him. My brother thought he could hold it over my mom in some way, but she was having none of that and told the rest of us. Evidently, the guy was in the Navy but went AWOL, which I think was grounds for divorce during the war. I always knew I was adopted. I was 10 when it happened, but I got all my files from my adoptive mom when I turned 21, and it shed much light. I don't know how, maybe because it was the 90s and HIPAA laws were less strict, but I ended up with my birth father's confidential therapist notes from his counseling sessions. I always wondered why he was so angry, but the details of abuse, neglect, and his internal struggle with being gay in a world that would never accept him changed so much of how I see him. I wish so badly that even if he lost all his kids, he wouldn't have killed himself and would have made it to today. Who knows who he would be, what happens he could have found, and how his anger could have transformed. I feel guilty for reading those files too, but I didn't know they were until I read them. So many complex feelings from this one stack of papers. My father has a cousin, second cousin. I found out about it a few years ago. He also had a great aunt who was still living. When I asked why he never told us about them, he said it was because the great aunt was a spirited racist and also the policyholder of my great-great-grandfather's inheritance. She died believing that my father never had children, because if she had found out that he had 3 biracial children, she would have cut him out of the inheritance and divided his portion amongst his cousins and 2 siblings. His cousin isn't a racist, but my dad says she's still a bitch, so that's why he doesn't speak with her. For anyone still reading, apparently my great-great-great-grandfather was a savvy businessman who was also a millionaire, lost it all during the Great Depression, and then built his wealth back up with a barrel-making business. With that being said, no, I'm not a millionaire, nor is my family. It's a long story. That my biological father tried to kill me multiple times before my mother got away, and that he only kidnapped my sister. Mother only found her missing middle of the night hours after he had stolen her. Mother and brother were married 63 and 73, I think. I was always told I was hiding from my bio so he could steal me in the night. He had only managed to grab my sister just as my mother walked in, so he was forced to leave me behind. Then he kept my sister hidden. Mother attempted to get her back, but back then states didn't really cooperate with out-of-state court orders. She was threatened with imprisonment if she returned to try and get my sister. When I was 14, my sister called me grandmother, and I just happened to answer the phone. Off and on, over the next 4 years, my sister and I talk. I wanted nothing to do with bio. He did keep trying to push it, but I was angry. He took me from the one thing I wanted, my sister. Grandma decided to tell the truth of her kidnapping. I invite my sister to my high school graduation. I forbade her bringing my bio, but accepted that she'd bring her boyfriend. I'm sitting in the over 700 graduates. I look and find my sister. The second I lock eyes, I look at the boyfriend next to her, and suddenly I want to crawl away and kill the man next to her. I'm not a violent person. I do not hate anybody. This man I hated with every fiber of my being. I go home and sit my mom, dad, and grandma on the couch. I say, okay, the truth. What the happened? Why do I hate him? That's when each one explained to me that he had smothered me with a pillow, chased me with a hammer, and fired a gun at me that luckily had been unloaded, and the many different ways he tried to kill me. I'm glad my dad and I chose each other. I now know they should have gotten me into therapy. That my great-great-grandparents weren't biologically related to us. They were servants to a well-off family in Mexico and had actually kidnapped my great-grandmother from the house people and fled with stolen money supposedly to the U.S. This was like 1880s. That I found out those details later on. What I knew, even as a kid, was that no one liked those two going from what was said, and that she was the ringleader of the whole family circus because she was somehow independently wealthy, and that part always stuck out as soon as I could, because I think what a woman from Mexico in those days would look like and have money with a husband that essentially had no say in anything. She owned half a block of homes, which the freeway took after she was dead in the 50s, but she owned another, like 6 around town, that family which lives in to this day. And the trade-off to being given one of these homes, according to my grandparents, was that she was expected to not only name any child they had, but determine who they eventually got married to. Arranged marriage, and evidently no one had the balls to tell her to go pick herself up until my grandfather is here. My grandmother, who was the non-grandchild to her, did, which won my grandmother the next Don in the family title once the old bat died. And that nonsense I could write a book about, since I witnessed some of it toward the end, because she has a spine. It's crazy thinking back just as normal. You don't understand and think it's odd, but how normal is it? And how normal was it to be where there is a kid with fully grown adults, sometimes even older than her, come by and they talk with grandmother, asking what they should do for her siblings, blessing, or to do whatever. It was wild.